Hello, Rams, and welcome to another episode of Rams History. Today's topic will be the American Revolution. So, Great Britain had won the Seven Years' War and, of course, had achieved a great victory. The British had achieved control of North America. However, this war came at enormous expense. It cost Great Britain a great deal of money to achieve this victory. And, of course, Great Britain now has some very serious financial problems. So what Parliament is looking for is more revenue. Parliament is trying to find ways to cover the debt left over from the Seven Years' War. And it's decided that much of that revenue should be obtained in the colonies. It was felt this was only fair since the Seven Years' War, or French and Indian War, had been fought in many ways in defense of Britain's overseas colonies in North America. So it was felt that perhaps the colonies should pay what Parliament regarded as their fair share of the cost of the war. So shortly after the end of the Seven Years' War, Parliament began imposing taxes on the American colonies. And these included, for example, the Sugar Act of 1764, which placed a tax on sugar and molasses. It was followed shortly by the Stamp Act of 1765, which placed a tax on all paper goods, all printed matter. Now, Parliament felt this was a simple matter, and they felt that they were within their rights to tax the colonies because the belief was that Parliament represented all Englishmen, whether they were at home in England or overseas in the colonies. However, the American colonists saw this matter in a very different way. They felt that they did not have direct representation in Parliament and that these taxes were an imposition upon Parliament. Of course, we're all familiar with the cry of no taxation without representation, and that's exactly how the colonists felt. So what begins is a process that will continue for some time where Parliament will impose taxes and then the colonists will rebel against them or do all they can to resist, eventually forcing Parliament to back down. And then, of course, the process repeats itself because the problem hasn't gone away. Parliament still needs revenue. Parliament still believes they are within their rights to tax the colonists. The colonists believe, on the other hand, that they are being taxed unfairly and illegally. The next taxes to follow are the Townshend Acts of 1767. Now, this basically placed a tax on certain imported goods like glass, lead, paper, paint, and tea. Again, the colonists oppose these acts fiercely through many means. They boycott goods, they create committees of correspondence to converse with England, and eventually Parliament repeals all of the Townshend Acts with the exception of the tax on tea. Now, as a part of the Townshend Acts, Parliament had actually sent troops to the colonies to help enforce the tax. And it was in the city of Boston that these troops eventually caused some trouble. Boston was the center of opposition to these British taxes. And it was, in fact, in Boston where the American Revolution would eventually get its beginning. But there in 1770, of course, was the infamous Boston Massacre. Now, this was a very much misunderstood event where a group of British soldiers opened fire on a menacing crowd. In many ways, you can argue the crowd was responsible for the events that happened there. However, patriot propagandists would eventually turn the Boston Massacre into an event that was kind of a watershed in the history of the road to the American Revolution, as this print by Paul Revere very much illustrates. The event in this print clearly shows British soldiers firing on an innocent American crowd. The truth of the event was in many ways quite different, but this was the image that many American colonists chose to believe. Now, as mentioned, most of the taxes had been repealed except for the tax on tea, which continued to be a source of irritation for many colonists. And of course, eventually in 1773, the Boston Tea Party took place, where a group of men known as the Sons of Liberty go into Boston Harbor and they throw the tea overboard as a protest. Now, in response to the Boston Tea Party, Britain passes a series of laws known as the Intolerable Acts, which, among other things, closed the port of Boston. They shut down the colonial legislature in Massachusetts. They send additional troops to Boston, and in addition, also closed down courts within the colony of Massachusetts. These intolerable acts really sort of drive an even further wedge between the colony of Massachusetts and Great Britain, and also began to increase anxiety within the other American colonies. Now, it's only a short time after this, in April 1775, that we see the opening shots of the American Revolution at Lexington and Concord. Really, from this point on, any attempts at reconciliation are hopeless. The First Continental Congress had been hoping to sort of achieve a peaceful means of solving these issues, but after Lexington and Concord, that was no longer the case. And what had been an instance of misunderstanding and debate between the colonies and Great Britain has now become an armed conflict. You guys are familiar with the course of the American Revolution, so I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on the military aspects of it. Suffice it to say that the American colonies struggled along in their efforts against Great Britain. Eventually, the war would widen and actually become a European conflict with the entry of France and Spain. They both joined the conflict on the side of the Americans. And it was really in many ways French aid which was instrumental in helping to achieve an American victory. The French not only sent troops, but they also spent enormous sums of money, as well as sending uniforms, weapons, and equipment to the American colonists. Now, eventually, George Washington, the American commander, in alliance with the French, would defeat the British at Yorktown in 1781. Yorktown would really prove to be the last major conflict of the war, and at that point Britain decided that the American colonies were going to achieve their independence and began to make peace with the Americans. The war ends, of course, with the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1783, and the American colonies have achieved their goal. They have become independent of Great Britain, and a new nation, the United States of America, is born. Now, the American colonists were actually acting upon a political belief system which stretched back as far as the English Civil War. When the colonists were protesting what they thought to be unfair taxation, they were actually claiming the rights that they believed were due to them as Englishmen. And of course, some of this came from the tradition of John Locke, who wrote about the social contract. Right? Locke, of course, stated that a government that failed to meet the needs of its people was a government that could legitimately be overthrown. There were also a group of political thinkers known as the Commonwealthmen, and for example, they produced works such as Cato's Letters. Now, the Commonwealthmen argued that Parliament had become corrupt and that taxation was actually supporting what they regarded to be a corrupt political system. And the writings of the Commonwealthmen were actually quite popular in the American colonies in the decades prior to the war. Of course, Thomas Paine had given the American colonists a true sense of what they were fighting for. He was really one of the first people to actually write a clear justification for the American Revolution. And in fact, he very memorably said that it's somewhat ridiculous to expect a continent to be ruled by an island. But his pamphlet Common Sense became hugely popular and was read throughout the colonies and was cited by many as the intellectual justification for revolution. Remember that the Americans at first were simply fighting for what they believed to be their rights as Englishmen, but eventually, after Thomas Paine's Common Sense, many Americans began to argue that their needs would best be served by independence. Now, events in England somewhat, it confirmed many of the colonists' concerns. The king at the time was George III of the House of Hanover. He would eventually have a very long reign. He would rule England well into the 19th century. But George definitely believed in being a strong monarch. Now, of course, he did not want to be an absolute monarch. That issue had been settled by the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution. But he did believe in being a strong monarch, and so he took steps to strengthen the power of the monarchy. And in Parliament, he had an ally in his minister, Lord North. Lord North did everything he could to strengthen the friends of the king in Parliament. And many, even in England, were concerned about what they regarded as the king's consolidation of power. Now, there had been an incident in the years prior to the Revolution which confirmed the worst fears of many Americans, and that was the case of John Wilkes. John Wilkes was a newspaper publisher and a member of Parliament. He had published an edition of his paper which had been quite critical of Parliament, and he was accused of seditious libel. Wilkes actually wound up fleeing the country for a time. Now, eventually he did return to England, and eventually he did resume his seat in Parliament. But the fact that an Englishman had been driven out of the country for expressing an opinion in the papers was very troubling to many, and it confirmed actually what many believed, the theories of the Commonwealthmen, right? The fact that England had become corrupt, and that the fact that an Englishman could be silenced for speaking his opinion was very troubling to many and actually confirmed some of the fears of the colonists. Now, something that did come out of the war in England was the Yorkshire Association. This was a group of men who were dedicated to reforming Parliament. In example, they wanted annual parliaments, and they also wanted to make some reforms to the various boroughs from which members of Parliament were elected. Now, the Yorkshire Association did propose some very meaningful reforms, and they did actually have some sympathizers in Parliament. But unfortunately, after Lord North stepped down and the American Revolution ended, the Yorkshire Association somewhat fell apart. So although it did represent a desire for reform, and it did sort of speak to the idea that some Englishmen agreed with the Americans, the Yorkshire Association did not really achieve any really meaningful reforms. Now, what's the long-term impact of the American Revolution? Well, the American Revolution demonstrated to people in Europe that it could be possible to successfully rebel against a monarchy. The American Revolution was really the first major successful revolution of the old regime period. In addition, the French, of course, had spent enormous sums of money supporting the American Revolution, and it will be France's financial difficulties beginning in the 1780s that will eventually tip the country into the French Revolution. So the American Revolution in many ways would lead to the much more politically difficult and bloody French Revolution immediately afterward. Well, all right, Rams, that was a quick look at the American Revolution, and I do hope you enjoy your time here. As always, like and subscribe, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.